Higher Universe Pictures.
Welcome to the Paranormal Phenomena Podcast with Brandon Rhiness and Elizabeth Chamberlain.
I'm Brandon Rhiness.
And I'm Elizabeth Chamberlain.
Welcome to the Paranormal Phenomena Podcast, where we talk about ghosts, aliens, and the unexplained.
If you like our podcast, be sure to subscribe. And we'd love it if you could like, share, and comment on our show. Those likes go a long way in helping us reach a wider audience, and we really appreciate that.
So, Elizabeth, we are officially on a podcast.
Wow.
Kind of crazy. This is my first one. I've done lots of interviews on podcasts, but I've never been the host of one.
Right.
And I'm happy to have you as my co-host. It's not like we don't work together enough to begin with.
Yeah.
For those of you who don't know, I am a writer-director, and Elizabeth is an actor, and we've worked on quite a few movies together now. And our most current one, Grotesque, we began shooting, and then it got railroaded due to COVID issues, so it's put on hold till the spring. So we needed something to do, and I've always had an interest in the paranormal. So I decided to make that the focus of this podcast.
Brandon, are you secretly just looking for, stories for your future scripts? Is that what you're secretly doing here?
That's a byproduct. If I want to, use this to data mine for future horror stories, then I might do that. But I got enough to go on already, so this is kind of
that's true. You're never short for ideas. That's for sure.
So this is the first episode of this podcast, and we're still trying to figure things out, both on the technical side and the content side, and we're hoping it'll improve over time, and we'll kind of figure out what people are interested in. So if you have any ideas for the show, feel free to reach out to us and let us know. If you have any questions about us or about anything to do with the paranormal, you can email us at paranormalphenomenapodcast@gmail.com, and just give us your questions and we'll try to have them answered. Okay, so let's welcome our first guest. Morgan Knudsen is a paranormal expert and investigator. She was featured on an episode of A Haunting and is a recurring guest on the TV shows Paranormal 911 and Haunted Hospitals. She is also the award-winning founder of Entity Seeker Paranormal Research and Teachings, and she is known for her inspiring lectures that include fire art demonstrations, mind-blowing evidence of the paranormal, and uplifting stories. Morgan Knudsen, thank you so much for being on the show today.
Oh, glad to be here.
I first discovered you was watching A Haunting. It was the episode that you were on, and that was a few years back. I was watching with my girlfriend, and in between scenes, they cut to a shot of the skyline, and I was like, is that Edmonton? And then later on, they showed another shot. I'm like, that is Edmonton. I recognize the Shaw building.
What's funny about that too is that it was one of the only episodes that they filmed in Canada, and which was super cool for me that they picked Edmonton. But it was pretty much the only episode, at least up until that point, that they shot in Canada.
Yeah, so Cynthia and I, we Googled your name, and sure enough, it's like, oh, she's from Edmonton. So she messaged you, and then we found out about the ghost tour that you host, and we went on that, and it was a very cool experience. I recommend anyone in Edmonton or the surrounding area that when COVID is over, obviously, you check that out, because it's not only interesting in the paranormal side of things, but also just historical buildings in Edmonton. I learned a lot of stuff that I had no idea about. We walked through the cemetery, and there's some famous people buried there that I had no idea about, and so I learned a lot. So I would highly recommend that. First question, I guess, is just starting at the beginning. What made you want to get into the world of the paranormal?
Well, it's funny. It's been a long story, a long history for me, because my great-great-grandfather founded the first paranormal association in Canada back in the early 1900s, and he was a very noted physician in Ontario. He was very, very famous. His house is now a historical location, and his books were so influential in the world of Canadian parapsychology. But I actually didn't know about him, oddly enough, until about 6 years into my own career. I've been doing this for about 20 years now. And it wasn't until about 6 years into my own career and whatnot that I discovered him. So it goes right back in the family. But the initial incident, when I was probably about 8 or 9 years old, I was living in Surrey, BC at the time, and I had a really frightening incident. lived in a fourplex, and it was a 2-level fourplex, and we had some really strange goings on at the time. Didn't know what it was. I'd never experienced anything like this before. And my mom and dad were trying not to freak me out. Really good parents, they tried not to freak me out. And but the instances just kept piling up. And the one morning I'd come downstairs, I heard somebody in the kitchen downstairs, and it was about 5 a.m., still dark outside. And I came around the corner, and I could see that the lights were on in the kitchen. And where you were standing at the end of the stairs, you couldn't actually see into the kitchen, but you could tell whether or not there were lights on. And I came out sort of towards the living room, and I said hello. And as soon as I said hello, the noise in the kitchen stopped dead. And it was so weird, and it was such an eerie silence. I thought I'd walked in on a burglar, because it was just the noise just stopped and everything just froze. And I went to lean over to turn on the living room light, and the light wouldn't go on, which was weird because the light was perfect. It was fine. It was a lamp on the end table. And I look up, and I could hear footsteps coming out of the kitchen, except where somebody should have been, there was nobody standing there. And this sort of opaque figure came around the corner, and within 2 seconds, this thing was in my face, and I just lost it. I was terrified. I screamed for my mom and dad. I don't even remember doing it. I was halfway up the stairs, and my mom and dad came. They met me on the stairs, and my dad was of the same mindset. He thought somebody broken into the house, and so he went downstairs, and the first thing he did was reach for that lamp, and the light turned on, no problem, no questions asked. And there was nobody there. There was no one in the house. There was nothing disturbed. And we realized at that point that we had to acknowledge what was going on. And it was an incident. Even though it scared the crap out of me as a kid, I was so curious as to what in the hell happened, that I couldn't leave it alone.
Wow. Did your parents believe you when you went through this, or were they just like, this kid?
No, they did. They did. My mom and dad were very much believers in the paranormal. They've had numerous incidents happen to them over their lifetime too, but they weren't really willing to bring up a lot around me before this incident, because I think at the time the level of education with the public was very limited.
Right.
I always felt really fortunate because there were no real entertainment paranormal shows on television at that time period, and the investigators that were featured on shows like Sightings and things like that were really reputable people, doctors and doctors in parapsychology and whatnot, people like Carrie Gaynor and Lloyd Auerbach and all these, Barry Taff, all these influential individuals who really knew their stuff. So when I started to look into it, I was so fortunate to not have this sort of entertainment, jump scare world. I just had the academic side, so I started growing up with that side of things.
So I always find it strange because, like you said, that your parents had these things happen to you over the course of your life, and after watching a Haunting, I know other things happened to you. For me, nothing's ever happened. And so do you think it just seemed like, is it a personal thing where some people are going to experience these things where other people won't? How does that work?
Well, what's interesting is that they've actually found that certain people do experience more. There's been a number of university studies trying to understand exactly what that is. And they've realized that there are actually personality traits and whatnot that make people more prone to experiencing this stuff. And interestingly enough, openness is one of them. How open you are to the idea of the phenomenon in experiments like Gansfeld experiments, which is basically where you have a person that's receiving imagery, a mental imagery from another person in another room. The level of success on those Gansfeld experiments will depend on somebody's outgoingness, their openness, their own self-doubt, their own, there's a whole pile of factors. So that's definitely, I think, a part of it. I think another part of it, though, is people's state of being. And this is something I've harped on with my teachings for a really long time, and the connection that my business partner Stephanie Wirtz and I uncovered very early on when we were doing research was that what we experience in in an emotional state, and how we are emotionally seems to have a very direct influence on what it is that we experience on the paranormal level. So I think there's a numerous factors going on with that.
I watched your presentation or video or whatever on that, and I thought it was very fascinating and lots of truths in there. So you do a lot of things, hey? You do presentations, you do ghost hunting or whatnot. You're even an author. You're a visual artist. So like, what exactly? What are all your jobs? Can you explain that a little further? What kind of things do you do in the paranormal?
Well, it's funny usually when people ask me that, I'll tell them I'm a researcher in the paranormal, and they can usually buy that. And then when I tell them I breathe fire, I lose them. They're like, no, like we can suspend belief for this part. We can't suspend belief for the other part. But yeah, like I try to make everything. I've got my finger in a million pies, but I've always tried to make everything blend together, and it all sort of feeds one end. And I think that is the exploration of consciousness and understanding how our perception is in the world and things like that, and how we perceive just as human beings what is consciousness, which is the root of the name entity seeker. And with my fire work, because I breathe fire and I eat fire and do all sorts of crazy things with fire, but I bring that into my lectures and I bring that into my teaching. So, we talk about things like mind over matter. We talk about paradigm shifting, understanding that, you can go against the grain with something as fundamental, say, for example, as our fear of fire and what we think we know about it. Mm-hmm. We can take that and translate that into the paranormal. If I can break down somebody's paradigm that, there is nothing that fire does but destruction and burning, then if I can break that paradigm down with my audience, then I can break their paradigm that either the paranormal doesn't exist, or that, this is something that's all in their heads, or whatever it is. So I try to make everything kind of meld together in that field. But yeah, I do, or I did before the crazy COVID here, a lot of live shows. That's where my passion lies with this stuff, is in the teaching. I taught the psychology and social work programs at a lot of the post-secondary education. I taught in there, and it's been quite the adventure. But I try to make everything cohesive.
Awesome.
So as we were talking earlier about your ghost tours in Edmonton, to a lot of people that may not know where Edmonton is, for one, it is in the province of Alberta in Canada. And for people that are from Edmonton, they may want to know, it may not seem like a hotbed of paranormal activity, but what are some of the more interesting and scary stories that have happened in the city that you might want to share?
Oh, there's so many. And I think you're right. Edmonton gets sort of knocked off the board somehow from paranormal stories, and I don't know why, because we've probably got, Alberta in general probably has one of the darkest histories of Canada, and dare I say, but we've really got some bizarre history, and I would say probably one of the most unnerving cases that I've worked over the years has been cases involving a First Nations sort of legend, I guess, called the Wendigo. And I've had some interesting ties into this because one of my dear friends, Matt Spearin, who I've worked with for the last 18 years, his childhood was wrought with these absolutely horrifying encounters of this dog-like, long, spindly, emaciated figure crawling through his window as a child. Then this lasted for a good, I don't know, it was about 6 years of his childhood, and his parents were trying to deal with it and him, and he ended up coming down with the symptoms of what you would imagine would be Wendigo psychosis, or what's been documented as Wendigo psychosis. Of swollen hands and feet, the rash, it just crazy. And the doctors didn't know what was wrong with him. So he grew up not knowing anything about the Wendigo or anything else. I mean, it just wasn't common knowledge back in the 70s. And when it wasn't until years and years later, and I mean probably about 5 or 6 years ago now, that he ended up listening to a podcast, of all things. And on the podcast, they were talking about one of the principal legends of the Wendigo, one of the core stories of the Wendigo, happened probably about 10 minutes walking distance from his house, where he lived as a child. And it was the story of Swift Runner, who ended up eating his family down in Legal and Egg Lake area, and showed up in St. Albert here in Alberta, basically knocked on the door of a very small mission, Lacombe Mission, which is still in St. Albert. And he said, my family starved to death. He was an Indian trapper, a Cree trapper. And the priest at the time, they took him in, the fathers took him in, and they realized something wasn't quite right, because the guy he's 6'5", and he was about 200 plus pounds, 300 pounds. He did not look like this emaciated, someone who was starved to death. So they ended up calling the police. And until the police got there, because of course they're journeying by horse from Fort Saskatchewan, they were dealing with Swift Runner in the middle of the night, screaming and calling out and having these horrible nightmares that this monstrous, dog-like, spindly, emaciated figure was coming through the window trying to attack him. And he was described just like Matt. He had the same symptoms, everything. So they took him up to Egg Lake. They discovered, of course, that he had eaten his family. He'd murdered his children. He'd killed his wife. It was horrid. And so anyway, at the end of the whole thing, he ended up to be the first legal hanging in Alberta at the Fort Saskatchewan prison, which is now the Fort Saskatchewan Museum. And Matt discovered that not only did his encounters completely mirror and mimic what Swift Runner had experienced, but here he was living, feet from this guy's the mission where he stayed. So, and he also discovered that his grandmother, it was either his grandmother or great grandmother, lived in the same area and then in the same community as Swift Runner. The time. So the odds of them actually crossing paths were pretty likely. So it was a really interesting case, and there's still cases of these really bizarre looking kind of dogmen that I get every once in a while. People message them to me, but it's really bizarre. And as I say, Alberta and our history, it's pretty creepy. Yeah.
I don't imagine when I think about the Wendigo, like it's so interesting that happened so close to home. I've heard like kind of Bigfoot stories in this area because we got a lot of forests and stuff, but Wendigo, I just imagine, I don't know where I imagine it would be, but it's so interesting that it's things like that happen this close to the city.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people imagine them more into the Great Lakes region, because a lot of the Wendigo stories and whatnot come from Wisconsin, Great Lakes, Ontario, things like that. But a lot of the encounters that people have had over the years with these things, whatever they are, tend to be in Alberta, in the sort of the prairie areas and things like that, where there's woods. Anywhere where there's isolation and famine, and that kind of emotional chaos, and it fascinated me, because it was something that I always wrote off to a point, not in a negative or dismissive way, but it was something that I guess I'd stored in my memory or stored in my knowledge banks as folklore, and which was silly, because ultimately, I mean, you look at things like Sasquatch and whatnot, and obviously there's truth to the stories, and it was a big wake-up call for me to start reevaluating some of the things that I was hearing, and to check my own bias.
I've always found it kind of funny, there's never been kind of any proof of these things existing, but it's hard to be fully skeptical. Yeah. If you're 100% skeptical, it's like there's a hell of a lot of liars out there, which I don't believe that all these people would make this up for no reason, or people that are just so completely insane they're seeing things that doesn't add up. That just seems just as unlikely to me as these things being real. But sometimes you hear a lot of there's like the Bigfoot, there's the Dogmen, there's the Wendigo. They're all kind of given these different names, but just from what I've been kind of learning, it seems like there's a bit of like crossover between them, where maybe these are just different names for the same thing.
It depends on the story. Like, I mean, usually you get into the Dogman stories, for example, like the Beast of Bray Road, which is Elkhorn, Wisconsin. And then, you kind of get this crossover into the Wendigo or the Michigan Dogman or something like that. But even with the Michigan Dogman versus the Beast of Bray Road, there's a bit of a difference where the one seems to be more on the spiritual side, where the other seems to be more of a physical being that's will pick up and eat roadkill and things like that. Where we get the Wendigo, where it's definitely more leaning towards the spiritual manifestational side of this stuff. So I think there's an overlay, and yet there are the big differences in between as well.
See, I remember even just hearing about Mothman, that type of thing, and then you hear about the Jersey Devil, and it just sounds like the same thing being described. Like at a bank robbery, where people describe the culprit in different ways, even though it's the same person, but it's just kind of the way they see it. Yeah. But I'm like, is this the same thing? And then you hear about some version in the UK, and it's like, that sounds like the same thing, just called something different and described in a slightly different way.
I think there's some overlap, but I think when you get really into the case itself, then you start to kind of piece out the differences. Like, for example, with Mothman, they've never found a set of tracks, for instance, where with something like the Jersey Devil, there's been tracks that have been photographed on rooftops and things like that where they shouldn't be. So I think it's in the evidentiary differences where you start to find the separation between the cases.
So I guess if the question was if you believe these things are on the spiritual side or if they're on the physical side, you kind of come in that they're both.
Yeah, I mean, and I think too, there is the element of folklore as well. I mean, a lot of these stories, you can trace a pattern of storytelling and changes within the story depending on the culture, depending on where if it's a First Nation story, of course it's getting passed down and passed down and passed down. So you get the folklore element as well. So it becomes really hard sometimes to trace back some of these cases. When Matt and I were doing the research for the Wendigo section of my book, Teaching the Living, we had a really hard time nailing down even the story of Swift Runner, which is it's a solid historical event that happened. There's no question it happened. He, as I say, he was the first legal hanging in Alberta. It happened. But when it came down to finding the records of, who he killed, for instance, who in the family was killed, was it 4 children? Was it 3 children? Was it 5 children? Was his wife there? Was his mother there? And it, depending on where you went, those aspects changed as well. We ended up digging into the actual police reports and the journals of the officers who were at the Fort Saskatchewan prison to find out that information, because depending on who you talk to, it was a different story. It got really, really tricky.
Wow. But at the same time, I feel like the different stories and stuff often give credibility to the story. I don't know, like if lots of different people who haven't conversed or who have conversed over different decades or whatever share the same story or a similar story, it makes you feel like, some things are lining up here.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's where, you start to see crossovers in descriptions too. A friend and colleague of mine, Chad Lewis, he just wrote a fantastic book on the Wendigo, called Wendigo Lore, and it's just brilliant. I can't say enough about this book, but he chases these folklore stories all over the place, and he's found the same thing, that you talk to these witnesses and there's just certain hallmarkers that are every time they're consistent. It's in one area, for example, in the Great Lakes region, the Wendigo looks quite different than often in the West. Like the same behaviors but different appearance. So in the West, you get this sort of this dogman looking thing that's very similar to like what you'd think of as a dogman, but still with a very emaciated skeleton, known as like 10 feet tall. They're huge. They're like spindly trees and patchy fur and all of this kind of thing. And yet if you go over to the Great Lakes, you've got a being that looks a little bit more like Slender Man, that's very pale face, long arms and legs, but the fundamentals remain the same. So they end up with the sort of rib cage, starvation looking effect in their bodies, and they're still as creepy as hell. So descriptions vary, but at the same time there's these hallmarks that sort of translate over. It's cool.
Yeah, I grew up on Saskatchewan in a Pehona, a gathering place for Indigenous peoples, and I heard the story of the Wendigo like as a very small child, and to this day it creeps me out to no extent. It's scary.
Oh yeah, I think out of all of the prairie lore, I think it's got to be one of the worst, you know, cryptid kind of beings that are out there. I mean,
Yeah.
it's really it's so disturbing. But entityseeker.ca is my website. You guys can find every possible video. There's my firework and stuff like that that's on there, and you can check that out. My other website, the other meat, is snakeandpire.com. Snakeandpire.com. So it is the website that I put the majority of my fire shows to. My partner does a lot of the music for it, and we have a blast. But all my weird fire performances and fire breathing and that kind of crazy is all there. So.
Well, Morgan, that was awesome. This went way longer than I thought it was going to. It was so interesting. I was worried that we were going to run out of things to talk to, and I honestly have like 100 more questions I want to ask, but we got to be reasonable with our time. So we might end up splitting this over one or two or more shows, but we would love to have you on again in the future, and maybe we can talk about different things or kind of get into more details on one particular aspect. Yeah, so
make your plan.
So I'm assuming once COVID is a thing of the past, hopefully soon, your ghost tours will kind of start up again and everything will go back to some semblance of normal.
Yeah, that's the idea, you know, like I missed the live shows incredibly. That's really what I love to do, and being with an audience, you know, everybody has been bugging me to do virtual shows, and turn them into virtual things and whatnot, and I can't bring myself to do it. It's just not the same. There's nothing like a live audience, and I mean I got a strong background in theater. I've been in theater my whole life. My partner, he's been in theater for 50 years. And it just, it's just not the same. So as soon as it is all clear to be doing live shows again, that's where I'll be.
Awesome. Well, thanks again. It was great having you on, and I guess we'll be in touch, and we hope to speak to you again soon.
That sounds wonderful.
Awesome. Thanks,
Awesome.
Morgan.
Thanks, guys.
Be sure to tune in next week when we'll have the second part of Morgan Knudsen's interview. So, Elizabeth, what do you think about that interview with Morgan?
I thought it was really cool. I think she's so cool. Just everything she was saying, I was like, wow, this lady is the like epitome of cool. Like, oh, I love her.
She knows her history. She just knows so much about it, and I found it quite surprising that there's so much in Edmonton that I never realized. And actually, one of the funny stories is kind of a huge coincidence. There's one building, it's on Jasper Ave. I think it's a school now or something. It's a really old building kind of near 90th Street. And she was saying that she went in there with her team one time and they had a videographer and stuff. And this place was supposed to be haunted, and something like pushed the videographer. And I remembered that story. And then later on, she mentioned his name, Richard. And I found out that was the same guy who replaced me when I worked at Channel 7 in Grand Prairie. When I moved away, he was the guy that replaced me, and we were kind of buddies. And I was like, no way, that was like, what are the odds that this one person would be the one that I know? You know, that was kind of crazy. And then I ran into him. I was doing an interview promoting one of our movies on, can't remember what TV station it was, and Richard was working there. He's like a freelancer, and I bumped into him, and so we chatted, and I brought that up, and he was like, oh, so he told me, you know, what happened with the story. So that was very interesting.
Yeah, you're right. She does, she has a lot of information about a lot of things, but I think what makes her even more credible is that she admits the things that are still unknown, you know? She allows there to be space for things that we don't have answers for yet. And so that's what I really liked. That's what I really liked about like listening to her, was just that like I kind of felt like there was still room for more knowledge. There was still room for, more discoveries and stuff. And obviously that's to do with her work. She needs to be discovering things all the time. So I thought that was what made her most credible in my mind.
Yeah, definitely. I think you have to have an element of that. If you come into this type of stuff thinking you know everything, I mean, there's never a time when where you can't learn more,
Yeah.
right? So if you kind of come in here, I know everything, there's nothing more to learn, then people should probably not be listening to you. You have to be looking for something better. And
Yeah.
we want to do a segment on our show where people can submit their scary stories, their paranormal experiences to us, and we will read them on the air. Today we're going to start with something somebody submitted to us. Her name is Julie. You might be able to figure out who that is if you know us. But other than that, I will keep her identity a secret and just call her Julie W. Julie sent us this text, so I will just read through it now. So my story begins in 2010. I was living downtown Edmonton on Jasper Ave, and it was the only house on the street. It was a little blue house with a white picket fence, and something felt off from the day I moved in there. The house was built in 1930. The main floor and the top floor were finished, but the basement wasn't. It didn't matter where you were in the house, it never felt like I was alone. A few months after my boyfriend and I moved in, our friend Lance joined us as a roommate. I had mentioned to both my boyfriend and Lance about the creepy feelings I had while I was in the house, but they just thought I was crazy. Then one day, while my boyfriend was at work and Lance was upstairs playing video games, I had the first real supernatural thing happen. I was standing in the kitchen washing the dishes. Behind me to the left is the fridge. Behind me to the right is a large cutting board. My phone was sitting on the cutting board. I didn't realize it at the time, but I was humming a song that was totally unfamiliar to me, and I still don't know what it was, but it was very old-timey, if that makes sense. In the middle of my humming, I heard my phone crash to the floor. However, it didn't just fall off the cutting station, because when I turned around, it wasn't on the ground next to it. It was all the way across the room on the floor in front of the fridge, as if it had been thrown. I immediately stopped what I was doing and ran upstairs to Lance's room and started banging on his bedroom door. He opened the door startled, and I told him my story, and he believed me because I was in such a panic. And when he came downstairs and saw where the phone had landed, he agreed that something weird was going on. My boyfriend wasn't convinced and assumed that Lance and I were exaggerating. A couple of months later, my boyfriend's parents came to visit, and we were all sitting in the living room on the couch, and on the couch behind us was a very large picture of downtown New York. The picture was so large that it was resting on hooks that were bolted into the wall. The hooks themselves are about 3 inches long, so in order to take the picture off the wall, you first needed to lift it 3 inches and then remove it. Oddly enough, I was in the middle of telling my boyfriend's mom about the cell phone story when the picture of New York came crashing down behind us. My boyfriend's mother really believes in the supernatural, and she immediately believed me from the cell phone story. So when the picture fell, she jumped up, grabbed her shoes, and left. My boyfriend still refused to believe that anything supernatural had happened. Nearly a year later, my boyfriend and I were laying in bed together at night, laying on our sides facing each other, eyes closed, about to drift off to sleep, when a woman's moan made us both snap our eyes open. It was as if she was laying right between us, and it was that loud and clear. At that moment, I didn't even feel particularly scared, more triumphant at my boyfriend's reaction. I said, "You believe me now, don't you?" And he finally did. The following year, our son was born, and nothing really happened again until he was about 18 months. He would tell us about the lady he saw in different areas of the house. He also mentioned someone he called Blackie that usually stayed in his closet. While living in the house, I had very vivid nightmares, as did my boyfriend, and I just figured that I was a nightmare kind of person until we moved out of the house to a new location, and the nightmares became very infrequent. The blue house downtown is no longer standing because it was torn down about a year ago, and a parking lot now stands in its space. And then Julie also adds, I forgot to tell you that Ace's, her son's, only recollection of the blue house to this day is all the creepy mannequins in the basement. There were no mannequins. So, what do you think about Julie's story?
Oh, that's so creepy. Oh my gosh.
So I guess that begs the question, have you ever had a paranormal experience?
Yeah, like I've had a few, but kind of as Morgan was saying, I haven't really had anything negative happen. Like all my paranormal experiences have been great. They've been wonderful. They've been fun.
There's a couple times where something, I'd say very minor happened. I remember this one apartment I lived in. I was laying in bed reading this one night, and I had a bottle of just like medication I was taking sitting on my nightstand, and then all of a sudden the bottle just kind of like fell off the nightstand. It was enough to be like, whoa, that was kind of weird. But I mean, my window was open, and it could have been the wind, and I didn't think much of it. And nothing else ever happened there. The only one that kind of threw me a little bit, which is, it's still not that big of a deal, was probably within the last year. I was at the downtown Tim Hortons on Jasper Ave in 101st Street, and I was standing there in line, and I felt someone walk up behind me, and it was quite a big lineup, and it was going slow. People get annoyed in a long lineup, and I swear I could hear this guy behind me. He's kind of like, ugh, just like groaning, like, man, this is taking forever. This is, and and he just kind of kept muttering things, and I was like, who is this jerk, and so I didn't want to turn around and look at him because there's a lot of sketchy type people that were there, and I didn't want to get in a fight or anything. So I was like, I'll just casually slowly turn around and just pretend I'm looking around and see what he looks like. So I turn around, and of course there's no one there.
Whoa.
And logic dictates that he probably walked away during that few seconds it took me to look, but it was enough to throw me because I was like, no, there was someone right behind me. Like I heard him. I just heard someone right there. It was enough that I kind of came home and had to tell people, and I was like, that was a weird thing, but I still don't consider that paranormal. I'm still going to err on the side of skepticism and assume that it was nothing, but that's the only time that anything like that's really happened to me. So, but I've always just had an interest in the paranormal. I mean, I'm primarily a horror writer, filmmaker. So I'm just kind of, I guess we're just blurring the edges here and just taking it a bit more into reality instead of it being straight up fiction. I kind of want to just, investigate things. I'm more on the skeptical side, but I do have an open mind. So I kind of want to just talk to people and figure out what's out there and hear alternate theories about how this all kind of works, and just have a fun time doing it.
I think I'm less on the skeptical side than you. I think I'm more on the believing side. Like I don't just believe anything, but I'm also kind of the mindset where like I want to believe them until they can prove me that it's not real, Like I would rather believe first and then be proved after than just like not believe and then maybe be proved it's right. So yeah.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I like to be well grounded in things.
Yeah.
And honestly, I find it just as the subject matter entertaining, even if it turns out this is all fake. It's still cool. I just find the idea of Bigfoot and aliens and just extraterrestrial abductions and the Mothman and Lizardmen and Wolfmen and Wendigo and all these. I just find it interesting things, right? I like stories, and there's so many of avenues in there to investigate, and I kind of hope we can learn a lot and talk to some really interesting people while we do this.
I agree. That sounds fun to me, Brandon. If you have an interesting story or experience about the paranormal, send us an email at paranormalphenomena.podcast@gmail.com. We won't use your full name, but please let us know your first name and where you're from. We look forward to hearing from all of you.
Well, I think that was a very good pilot episode of our show. I'm looking forward to doing more of these with you. Maybe we could just take a minute to talk about what we're working on, if anything, given the recent lockdown restrictions and COVID craziness. So what are you working on?
Oh, I thought you meant like what we're working on right now. What I'm working on, I'm mostly doing school right now, which is unfortunate because all my school's online and that's terribly boring, especially for an acting degree. But my schedule's just like fully packed with education right now.
Awesome. Yeah, I'm after Grotesque got canceled there or temporarily canceled. I just been writing a lot. I've been writing just an insane amount. I finished first draft of the Man in the Box novel, which is a horror novel. Hopefully that'll be out before too long. I've started writing I'm in Love with a Dead Girl, based on my movie script / short film, and I'm about a third of the way done that. And I've also been working crazy on writing short horror stories. Once I get to a decent number of them, I'm going to combine them into a horror anthology. So yeah, I'm going to have a whole lot of stories coming out soon. So, keep an eye out for those. How can people reach you, Elizabeth?
So I'm on all social media, like everywhere, and it's usually just under my name, Elizabeth Chamberlain. So it's like my Facebook page is facebook.com/Elizabeth Chamberlain page. My YouTube channel is youtube.com/Elizabeth Chamberlain. I have, I'm just everywhere. I'm on all social media, and I also have a website at that's www.elizabethchamberlain.com that can, send you to all those different places if you are having difficulty finding them. And then you can email me at email@elizabethchamberlain.com.
I'm also on all the major platforms at Brandon Rhiness. My YouTube channel is Higher Universe. That is my company, and that is where you'll find many of my films, many of them starring Elizabeth. So you can check that out. There's also a Higher Universe Facebook page that you can check out. And all my projects have their own Facebook page, so feel free to explore that. We would love to hear what you think about our films. And so feel free to comment on any of our posts. Okay, well, I think that was a great first episode, and I look forward to doing another one in, maybe a week or so from now. And I will talk to you later.
Talk to you later. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thanks for listening to the Paranormal Phenomena Podcast. See you next time.